wherever you're calling in from. I'm really excited to be here virtually with all of you. I'm even more excited to have with me today 3 incredibly distinguished panelists. The best type of panel to moderate is one where I get to listen to 3 people far brighter than me with far more insights than I have in this field. And I get to ask them interesting and difficult questions. So that's hopefully what you're going to get out of this session today. I know I'm very much looking forward to speaking with these 3 individuals. I wanted to start out by introducing myself. My name is Belkis. I work for Human Rights Watch. I've been a researcher with the organization for about 9 years now. And in my time with the organization, I've been working in various conflict zones around the world. And through that work have come into direct contact with humanitarian relief operations. And what I started to see in the last years, in some cases, was extremely worrying data practices. Humanitarian organizations gathering vast amounts of personal data, including biometric data, on beneficiaries, people that they were aiming to help. Now, of course, some of that data might lead to good assistance, but I've also seen practices where I think that data collection might have led to harm. At Human Rights Watch, we've been trying to document these harms because we think it is really important for the entire humanitarian field to know whether harms are actually occurring in order to remedy that and to avoid these harms in the future. In June of this year, we published a report at Human Rights Watch on data collection in the context of the Rohingya crisis. We looked at 2018, where UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, came into camps in Bangladesh and registered the Rohingya population. It took their biometrics and other personal data, and it shared that data with Bangladesh. Now, UNHCR knew that that data would then be shared by Bangladesh with Myanmar, and there were indeed risks related to that data sharing. The Rohingya had, of course, fled Myanmar, had fled war crimes, crimes against humanity, and fled to safety. And Rohingya even protested when the registration effort began, protested saying they didn't want their data to end up in the hands of Myanmar. Despite those protests, despite assurances from UNHCR that that wouldn't happen, it is exactly what happened. Human Rights Watch is embarking on other research in different contexts, including in Kenya, in Jordan, and in Iraq. And we're looking at the same issue. Data collection by humanitarians that is being either collected in a way that causes harm or transferred and shared in a way that causes harm. So that's what I can bring to the table, this research that I've done myself with people affected who've shared their data with humanitarian organizations. But I'd really like to hear today from these 3 distinguished panelists who have a huge level of expertise in the humanitarian field and in this question of how one deals with data collection and particularly the collection of biometrics. So, James, I wanted to start with you. I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself to the audience, and I'd like you to sort of really set the scene for us and give us the groundwork for the context we're discussing. I'd like you to tell us about, what the drivers are for using new technologies in the humanitarian field, and particularly technologies to collect data. I'd like you to tell us, what kind of technologies we're talking about and what kind of data we're talking about that's being collected, and then how we're seeing these technologies being deployed in the field. So I'll let you kick it off.
Thanks, Belkis, and it's a huge pleasure to be part of such an important and interesting conversation with great people. My name is James Eaton-Lee. I'm Director of Privacy, Responsible Data and Risk for a tech nonprofit called Simprints. Our mission is to enhance the effectiveness of global development. We primarily do this through biometric hardware, software, and cloud tools, which we build for last mile contexts and implement with partners to tackle various sorts of development problems. Pre-Simprints, I ran Oxfam's cybersecurity and data protection teams for about 4.5 years. Was data protection officer for the UK affiliate of Oxfam, its international secretariat, and more broadly, I've worked on a variety of digital rights projects and spent on about a decade in the cybersecurity industry. It's maybe useful first to align just to kind of think about what biometric technology is. Since I started talking, probably every audience member will have learned to recognize my voice or face in some respect. And in the back of your mind, you will have kept analyzing it to assess that the person that's talking is still the same one. A digitized version of this measurement of biological characteristics similar to this is basically what we mean by biometrics. The measurement of some aspect of a person's movement or their face or the way they speak. There are a whole range of modalities that are used across the family of biometric technology, from fingerprint to palm, face, iris, periocular, which is the kind of area above a face mask, movement, and a whole load more. The use of that sort of recognition in digital systems, usually based on a pattern or template that captures the essence of it and is the data that we talk about, is called verification. If I talk later in the panel and you didn't see who was on stage, or you kind of recognize me by my voice, this is identification, the use of the characteristic to pull one person out of many. And these are the two kind of main sorts of biometric that you often see used, one to many or one to one. The data itself is always in deployment tied to some broader identity tool. In a humanitarian crisis, this might be something very functional that's deployed as organizations work, perhaps registering participants to distribute food or verify coverage for a healthcare intervention. And the purpose generally is to individuate, to be clear that who you're working with is the same person that you worked with last week, last month, last year, for various purposes, to ensure continuity of care, referral pathways across institutions or organizations, to produce good data, often to deter or prevent fraud. These are some of the most common arguments that we hear for biometrics. As with most innovation, the power and the risk really comes from the same property or the same place. You can identify anyone biometrically. They're available in every context, even in contexts where there's no other form of identity, no civil registration, no state ID, nothing. If you're in a crisis and you need to ensure that you continue reaching the same people consistently and following up with them with no infrastructure available, biometric has the potential to allow you to get good data quickly. Because people carry their biometric factor with them, their face, their fingerprint, their movements, they don't need a phone, they don't need an ID card. So as well as ubiquity, there's also the potential for biometrics to be more dignified and potentially more anonymous for some use cases if they're used well. For all of these sorts of reasons, they've become quite common in humanitarian contexts, as well as in the broader development ecosystem, particularly for delivery of in-kind assistance, cash, and other sorts of intervention, as well as some long-term programming, more often one-to-one than one-to-N, so verification rather than identification, usually face or fingerprint, although there are other options. The audience might be aware already, and you kind of referenced at the beginning, two of the largest UN system agencies, World Food Programme and UNHCR, both have very large-scale integrations of biometrics into their digital systems. I touched on modalities of biometric already, perhaps giving a flavor that this is not one technology but a family, and of course it's clearly deployed in a lot of different ways, from foundational to functional. So maybe I'll end by just sort of exploring that a little bit more. One of the things that makes humanitarian data collection particularly unique and unusual is that you have these spaces where there's no foundational or state-issued ID, no infrastructure, and data is collected very quickly in crises that can be both unpredictable, also involve a lot of intervening actors, a lot of organizations sharing data, but then potentially over a very long period of time. Systems that are built in the white heat of a crisis are then sometimes used for very long periods to do follow-up interventions, which, as anyone with a data protection background will be thinking about, purpose limitation makes ethical design and ID quite challenging. And of course, then you have this additional layer that in humanitarian contexts with these very vulnerable populations whose rights and whose agency are likely to be under threat or non-existent. There are some huge ethical and rights issues, not only in terms of collecting data safely and ethically, but also a broader rights and ethics lens. Everyone is entitled to be seen and recognized where they want to be. Everyone's entitled to be able to access and freely make themselves available, freely make services available to themselves when they're entitled to access them. So there's a real balance here between risks to people, but also delivering assistance in a way that's dignified and ethical. So I think that gives you the flavor of some of the tech and the complexities. Biometric technology is a tool which a lot of humanitarian actors are looking for as a force multiplier for various reasons. Like most innovation tool and many tools, it brings not only its own power, but also the potential for miscarriage if it's not used properly.
Thanks so much, James, for laying that out for us and really helping the audience understand what exactly we're talking about and sort of the why we've seen this development and this desire in the humanitarian context to gather so much data and really the benefits, but also the potential negatives. Elizabeth, I'd like you to come in. I'd like you to introduce yourself to the audience and talk about a bit more about this issue James has raised, which is the sensitivity of this data, of biometrics. So can you talk a bit more about why biometric data is so sensitive? And let us understand how Oxfam has grappled with this, given that Oxfam is engaging in humanitarian work, emergency work around the world.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Elizabeth Shaughnessy. I work for Oxfam as a data privacy analyst on our information security team. So the work I do includes like business as usual, data protection, processing data, subject rights, logging risks, that sort of thing, all the way to humanitarian support. So working with our country teams on programs and training and occasionally emergency support. So both the operational side and some of the ethical side as well. And I also work on our new biometrics policy. So I led on the internal consultation that we had, and now that it's been signed off, working on the implementation. So to answer the first question, biometrics are especially sensitive because as James already highlighted, they're permanent and unique to an individual. So permanent meaning they last the lifetime of that individual, or they can with some exceptions. And they're multi-purpose. So they're like rich in information. They can be used for many purposes flexibly, which means basically that insights can be drawn about a person beyond the original purpose that they were collected for. And because they last a lifetime, and because they are, multi-purpose, because they're unique, we have to consider possibilities for the reuse of harm, for function creep, and technologies which maybe haven't even been developed yet. So looking beyond just the lifetime of any individual program or project, and thinking about what happens with this data to this person that it's connected to for the entirety of their lifetime. So Oxfam tries to grapple with these and other issues in the biometrics and foundational identity policy. In an attempt to look at what good practice looks like and have a practical framework for using biometric data safely and responsibly. I can say now that we haven't engaged with biometrics based on the policy from start to finish, because it does take time, which I'll get into later. But the policy itself attempts to address some of these core risks from sort of the whole data lifecycle. So looking from the beginning, what is the use case? Is there a clear plan? Do we know the data flow? Essentially, do we understand what's being planned for this data for the entirety of its lifetime? And can we mitigate the risks of the unknown? We also emphasize engaging with the people that we're working with. So this is an attempt to compensate for power imbalances that are inherent with working with beneficiaries in need of humanitarian assistance, and in particular with the sensitivity of biometric data. So attempting to compensate for the power imbalances, mitigate risks specific to their context. This involves communicating, building trust, ensuring that consent can actually be informed, that there is genuine choice, understanding both perceived and real risks, and so on. So essentially, before any data collection or verification, identification, any processing happens, you need to be having those conversations, that continual engagement. As I said, we also attempt to address issues around informed consent. Informed consent is generally the legal basis that's relied on to collect and process this kind of data. But there's an issue around whether or not it is consent, and then whether or not it is informed. So that again comes back to engaging with individuals, but also on the other side, engaging with donors to make sure that that it is actually a choice that can be, you can opt out of using biometrics essentially and still receive aid, because if you don't have that choice, then you just can't have that consent. In addition to that, we have robust data protection and security requirements. So a privacy impact assessment and a security review by a security professional. And then lastly, aiming to ensure that our partners share the same values as we do, because we don't operate alone in these contexts. We will often work with partners, likewise with donors or whoever is housing any sort of biometric system, and so making sure that we're all on the same page about protecting that data.
Thanks so much for that. It's really insightful to hear within specifically Oxfam how you've kind of thought through all the different ways that you can mitigate risk as much as one can. Of course, when we talk about sort of a humanitarian principle like do no harm, we're never actually talking about that. We're talking about do as little harm as possible. And yet, it's great to see that Oxfam is really trying to meet that standard of doing as little harm as possible. Stuart, our third panelist, I would love you to now introduce yourself, and I'd love it if you could kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about from your vantage point how you see the broader humanitarian sector trying to address some of the challenges that James and Elizabeth have mentioned, including particularly this issue of informed consent and whether that is even possible in a humanitarian context where someone is desperate for immediate assistance, food, water, shelter, and so of course is going to say yes to giving their personal details in order to get that assistance.
Thanks so much, Bilkis, and thanks to the organizers for having me as part of this discussion. My name is Stuart Campo, and I'm the team lead for data responsibility at the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs Center for Humanitarian Data, based in The Hague. We do not personally, as OCHA, collect this type of data, so I want to caveat my comments with that as an initial frame to say we're not really operationally dealing with biometrics as OCHA in our day-to-day work, but given our role both in a coordination function and also in an information management function, our work touches on these issues every day in terms of how our partners in different contexts are running up against both the challenges and opportunities that both James and Elizabeth have already mentioned. In terms of how the sector is approaching biometrics, but also data management more broadly, I think there are really three key areas where we've seen a lot of progress and where more work needs to be done and will continue to be done in the months and years ahead. The first is, to Elizabeth's last point, getting on the same page about what good looks like. What are the commitments that we're making together? What does doing data responsibility in practice actually look like? And in this area, we've made a really important step this year with the endorsement of the first ever Interagency Standing Committee operational guidance on data responsibility. This document is the result of over a year of work with over 250 humanitarians from every humanitarian crisis in the world, providing inputs and feedback to get to a point where we had a common set of principles and an agreed set of minimum actions for data responsibility, which are not specific to biometrics or any other particular type of data or data management, but really apply to how we should think about using data in humanitarian action writ large. So this is a really critical development, and we've seen since the endorsement of this framework a lot of momentum around both individual organizations doing data responsibility more systematically in their work, and also collectively moving toward approaching issues in a similar way with a similar lens to make sure that we're kind of raising the bar or having the tide raise all the ships together. This links to, but is separate from the second area, which is really more operational. So the practical action for data responsibility. There are a couple of things that I think are particularly relevant to the discussion of biometrics. The first would be, again, something that has been mentioned by my fellow panelists, looking systematically at risks and harms or impacts more broadly. This is the language that we use at OCHA and that is in the operational guidance from the IASC, looking at data impacts and data impact assessments. A commitment to doing this as part of any data management activity is essential, and that's now enshrined in the various sector-wide frameworks that we have. So how you do that and adapt that to a particular type of data like biometrics or a particular exercise like registration or verification, of course, will vary across organizations and contexts, but doing it at all is really the first step. And we need to see more of this. We need to see consistent application and documentation of impact assessments. And then we need to recognize together that this is not a one-off thing that you do at the beginning of a project and then hope that it sticks, because contexts evolve. We have more complex emergency settings than we've ever had before. And so we know that the nature and sensitivity of data will change over time. If we look at what happened recently in Afghanistan, specifically around biometrics, this is a really important reminder for us that when you assess the risks at the beginning of a project in a certain setting within a country, that setting will change and the risks and benefits will evolve or devolve depending on the particular setting. So that's really critical. And we're seeing a lot of progress on collective action through conducting these data impact assessments and establishing information sharing protocols so that, again, we have common commitments to how we make this data available or don't. And really sort of singing from the same song sheet and practicing what we preach is critical, because what we've seen in various contexts is that there will be pressure on different organizations that have more or less power to say no to requests for data. And this is really, really difficult to sort of exacerbate the existing power imbalances when it comes to the data that may mean you do or do not get access to deliver assistance, or you do or do not receive financial support to do your work. So we need to keep an eye on that. But this collective action area is critical, and we've made a lot of progress. The third is really more on building trust in the broader community. Biometrics is a really important area where this comes to a head, because you have a lot of private sector firms involved in both designing and delivering solutions for this type of work. You have governments in the form of host governments and donor governments. You have international organizations, UN entities, national and international NGOs. It's a large and mixed group of stakeholders. So building through events like this, the trust and understanding of the key issues at play is essential. We need to do more of it at the operational level. And that is one hope I have for next year, is fewer global Zoom events and more in-person, fingers crossed, discussions of these issues at the operational level. And I think that's a commitment we should all make, whether it's people like ourselves in global roles or really more colleagues at the operational level. Having these discussions is something that I'd love to think together about enabling, because it's really about enabling deliberation and the development of trust at the operational level with people affected by crises and those that are trying to serve them. That is going to move the needle on these issues.
Thanks so much, Stuart. I mean, your last point about trust, and particularly trust with the communities who are actually being asked to give their data, is so incredibly important. And that's why, I started out with this Rohingya example, where the Rohingya community, when they were protesting and saying, we don't want to register because we don't want our data shared with Myanmar, and they were told, no, don't worry about it, it's not going to be shared. And then it was. I mean, these kind of case studies are so detrimental to building that kind of trust. And communities really do and should have the right to know what's happening with their data from beginning to end, as you were saying also, Elizabeth. I want to pick up on something that's come up in one of the questions and lead that to my next question to you, Elizabeth. Someone asked about this issue of the right to be forgotten. This is something I think is really interesting. I learned recently through my continued work on UNHCR's database that actually the right to be forgotten is essentially not there. The system was designed, has been built, so that it is impossible to delete someone from it. And I think that really does cause many questions in my mind. The right to be forgotten, of course, is a core right when it comes to GDPR, so effective in Europe, not outside of Europe. But I'd love to hear more about, how, the challenges that you've seen in implementing your policy across the organization that, challenges you and your colleagues might have faced. I don't know how you think about this issue of the right to be forgotten, if you could maybe touch on that. And the question also asked about, really implementing the policies that are on the books. Some organizations have very good policies, but it really is about that implementation and operationalization. So I'd love to hear you talk a bit through, what you and your colleagues are seeing.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good point. I think, especially when we come back to how do we even justify gathering this data in the first place? And if it was consent, presumably then we would have engaged with an individual and explained what was going to happen with their data, explained their data rights with some kind of a privacy notice, potentially some other engagement style. This is the requirement that we have because, as you've mentioned, GDPR, we have other legal requirements. But also, it's a principle and a right that we stand by. In terms of operationalizing it, what it looks like in practice, when it comes to biometrics anyway, we haven't gotten that far. So I couldn't tell you exactly what it looks like. We haven't worked with the system where I could then tell you it wasn't built into the system. I can tell you if we're working with a system where you can't delete someone, then we wouldn't work with that system. but I mean, I think in terms of how we deal with it now, we can, we have channels that we can direct people to request the right, to be forgotten, to have their data deleted, to access any of their other data subject rights. I think that becomes challenging if you're relying more on like email, for instance, to exercise those rights, or a phone number to exercise those rights, versus like setting up a table where people can come up and ask what's happening to your data. Can I delete this? I, consented to this. Now I want to revoke it, and so on. So not, I don't have an exact answer for what this looks like operationally at the moment. I think what I would emphasize is, bearing all of that in mind, that it shouldn't come down to someone asking to be forgotten. It should be in a retention and deletion policy. It should be already noted that you have set time and resources aside from the very beginning at the contract phase to put in place a retention and deletion policy. Whether that is, you go through the contract, you put in place a program, you gather data, et cetera, and then you hold on to that data for 3 months for potentially an audit, and then you delete it. Or if it's in a database, who's then, the data controller, who's responsible for that data? How do you make sure that you delete local copies? How do you make sure it's deleted from any other, third party or partner that was working with that data? Yeah, I mean, as I said, I don't have, this is currently under the challenge column. I don't have an exact answer beyond this is the guidance that we can give. Making sure that it happens in practice will be touched on in trainings that we'll deliver and in any communications that we send out. And then also trying to work on the broader issues, which I'll get into in a second, around, this collective action is who's responsible for the data, who's asking for the data, who's requiring the data. So anyway, before I continue waffling, I'll just go back to some of the challenges that we're seeing in the policy itself. So as I said, we're only 6 months into having this policy live. We've only seen a couple of requests come by to see if we could work with this policy. And so far, I don't think that we'll be able to continue with the bids that we've seen, mainly for reasons that you probably will already see in other humanitarian programs. So we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, it's not enough resources. And then added on top of that, that we require certain technical expertise. So if we're getting a contract, for example, that's for 3 months, it's unlikely we'll be able to engage where biometrics are concerned, because it's just not enough time to have a privacy impact assessment, to do the security review, to do the trust building exercises, and so on. So that's a challenge. We're trying to figure out if we can, in the beginning stage, sort of negotiations, build in requirements for at the funding stage, as in you can choose to fund data protection, or you can choose to not have sensitive data collected. But so we're seeing how that goes. Another challenge is trust. So ensuring that we have trust with the communities that we're working with. As I said earlier, so much of this is context dependent. So if you don't have that trust, or if you don't have the trust with donors, for example, to be able to, sneak a peek into like whatever system they're using, or a vendor, if it's coming from a third party, you need to be able to have those clear channels of communication and transparency in order to be able to do any sort of data protection practice well and thoroughly. And that takes time. And lastly, Stuart had touched on this, the power imbalances piece. This is present throughout the entire system. So within, between donors and partners, between implementing partners themselves, whether they're local, whether, what their first language is, whether they're smaller, whether they're less well-funded. And then of course, with the people who we're working with. So trying to recognize those power imbalances and adjust to it and compensate for it as much as possible. But also there's still some unresolved issues. So like the donor incentive structure. So anecdotally anyway, we're seeing increased pressure where there's a sense of prioritizing compliance over other things. So over like people's rights over their data, over protection, the work itself, meaning that we are holding on to data for 10 years, which just creates risk because we might be audited, which is, in my view, unnecessary. So there's, over the last few years, we've seen this emphasis building on counter fraud, on anti-corruption, on anti-terrorism, which can mean anything from, beneficiary screening to audits. And so I think that this is sort of where the collective action piece comes into play, where no organization single-handedly is going to change how this works. Ensuring compliance is not a bad thing. I should emphasize ensuring that we don't see fraud and corruption and terrorism is of course a good thing. But there is a prioritization there that seems to be happening, where the negative consequences of compliance tick box exercises are unnecessary data retention, data not being deleted, too much data being collected just in case it's needed for an audit 10 years down the line, sensitive data being collected despite the fact that there are risks inherent with it, or without doing the due diligence just because it's required. So anyway, I will maybe stop there and let someone else speak.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You touched on so many different dynamics kind of swirling around that make this such a murky area, and increase some of the risks that we're potentially talking about. You touched on a lot. I was wondering, maybe James, if I could bring you in to pick up on some of the threads that Elizabeth mentioned. I know that you also have, from your vantage point, seen some other broader dynamics that are kind of contributing to the problematic. I also wanted to bring in a question that's just come in, and if you'd like to build that into your response. So the question is, to what extent can the concerns over collection of biometric data be mitigated by different technological architectures? It seems that we are limiting our ability to provide high quality and coordinated services because of the potential for political or other malfeasance. Shouldn't we start with the desired outcomes and build solutions from there? So maybe you can take my question and also see if you want to address that as you respond.
Yeah, definitely. And they're both really good questions. Connecting back to some of the things that Stuart and Elizabeth both said, particularly some of these themes of tools, of funding, of kind of application of existing tools, you get a sense, I think, of the richness of some of the challenges, which are not just technical. They're not just like, specific technology issues or issues to do with informed consent. They also have to do with an ecosystem of practice. When I spoke earlier, I think I touched on two of the things that make humanitarian biometrics stand out from other applications of biometric technology in aid or development, particularly the vulnerability of the people, and also the root of data collection, the use case itself is in a crisis, which means there's often this lack of time, infrastructure, and certainty. These things make it very tricky to build well. They're not new challenges, but I think what we are seeing is a rise in digitized vulnerability. We see data and information systems used increasingly invasively by a broad range of government and other actors. You just have to look this week or last week in the coverage of NSO Group's Pegasus software in the news to see how ubiquitous the use of highly sophisticated technology is to target activists, humanitarian actors, and vulnerable groups in the global south, which all raises the cost of being safe and what that design process looks like. From the audience member who asked the question about design. In the cybersecurity world, we'd be using words like threat model to refer to this, to begin to taxonomize the range of things, the range of actors which might affect you negatively, so you can engineer against it, and it's growing. It is the net result of this external change. Traditionally, humanitarian organizations, of course, are not known for being especially digital, and the sophistication of these attacks, plus the growth of the threat model they need to deal with them, means this pre-existing immaturity just becomes even more critical. And of course, many humanitarian organizations don't have particularly strong compliance cultures. We'll frequently talk about funding challenges with funding generally. Funding challenges particularly affect work like cybersecurity or privacy, which of course give rise to safety or responsible practice, because they're not program work usually. They come from cost recovery or contested unrestricted funding pots. So there's not only, the challenges not only becoming harder, but also harder to resource. And potentially also more expensive inherently. If you look in the broader environment, private sector actors are mostly reporting that they're increasing investment in these thematics at a rate that far outstrips most NGOs. Then, of course, we're all digitizing, we're all embracing data-heavy innovation, and there's a ton of dialogue, ongoingly in the responsible data community, and some really strong work, including the work that Stuart alludes to, which moves the dialogue on from a place a couple of years ago, which was, I think, mostly very principle-led, and which is now a bit more translational. There's a bit more tangible practice. We are moving. But even then, it's far from ubiquitous that NGOs will have support infrastructure down to program level, which facilitates things like privacy impact assessment or mainstreaming good cybersecurity practice. It remains quite elusive. And then, your question about kind of broad factors. Of course, these actors aren't acting in a vacuum. The humanitarian ecosystem itself is really complex. It's very porous. It's composed not only of traditional actors like UN system members or big international organizations, national and international NGOs, but also a range of local implementers and private sector partners, sometimes blurring the lines between kind of implementer and donor. And in a digital age, if you want to be serious about being serious and ethical, this is a conversation all of these actors need to be taking part in quite actively. And that diaspora, particularly as localized approaches become more common, as cash and digital ID, particularly multi-party digital ID, becomes more common. Not only is the risk growing, you have these thinly spread organizations with quite starved cores, diversity of actors who need to be responsible growing too. We all need to act together to produce safety critical outcomes, and I don't see us aggressively tackling that problem right now. So I think it's really tricky. It's a mess of complex system problems requiring a mixture of interventions to address. I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There are a lot of really smart people working on these problems, on change, on specific technical elements, on innovation. This question about engineering for outcomes, yes, absolutely. And in the biometric space, the point I made earlier about a family of technology, there are a whole range of ways that you store and use biometric data, and that includes a range of quite exotic and complex ways that you store biometric templates, which introduce different properties, which prevent the template from being turned back into a raw image and offset some risks to do with overpurposing of data, or which allow data to be cancelled. But it's very complex. Which one you choose, it's not a simple choice. It requires a complex set of solutions that are well matched to use cases and well engineered to achieve. So I think the bottom line is there's a big journey ahead of us. Whether you're a policymaker, a funder, or an implementer, you need to be realistic here about what it takes, what you need to fund, what it takes of you to do it well. It's achievable, but it's a challenge.
Thanks, James, for again bringing up many different threads, and I want to sort of tie on from the last point that you ended on, which brings me to you, Stuart. I wanted to ask you about, and you touched on it a little bit in your presentation and talking about some of the positive initiatives that you've seen and that you're involved in, but I wanted to hear from your perspective to tackle all of these challenges that James and Elizabeth and you have brought up, what you see as the role for the different stakeholders in this space. James, you just ended by talking about, the donor perspective versus the implementer. The UN is in this funny position where certain UN agencies are actually both at the same time. And so I'd love to hear from you sort of how you think through the role of the different stakeholders, and particularly UN agencies that are functioning as both. And I did want to bring up one point, which I don't think we've explicitly mentioned here, which is that we're talking about an atmosphere or an environment in which there is no legal framework, no legislation. We're talking, about organizations, if we're talking about the UN, that has immunity from national laws. So even if we were talking about a country that has a very robust data protection law in place, that wouldn't bind the UN in its collection of data in that country. More often, we're talking about, fragile states where there is no data protection law in place in any case. But so I think, just to make explicit, that this topic we're talking about is all the more urgent because we are operating in a space where there is no kind of legal avenue to pursue when organizations are potentially not abiding by good data practice and the right to privacy and data protection standards.
Thanks, Bilkis. That is a complex set of questions wrapped in the guise of a single question, but I will do my best to respond and then save time for our discussion. So I think just thinking about the roles of different actors, and I can get into the nuance that you asked me to address in terms of the multiple hats that certain agencies might wear. But to build on James's comments on the donor side, because this is certainly a piece of the discussion that continues to come up, and it's something that we've been trying to work on in collaboration with ICRC and the Swiss government over the past year, looking specifically at this issue of data sharing with donors. And I think the first piece is managing expectations, by which I mean, internally within a donor entity, being clear on the purpose for which this type of data might actually be required and be required as compared to another type of biographic data. And then the purposes for which it will actually be used by the donor as well as by the operational agency. Clarity on this is critical. And actually, this is critical across the board for all actors involved. But this can really help the donors then set clear terms of engagement and also be clear on their own data management requirements if they are going to request and receive that type of data, or even simply finance the collection and management of this type of data. So being really clear first internally and then transparently communicating that's another dimension of managing expectations, and being transparent is essential. And I think this is an area where there has not been as much progress as there could be, but we see a lot of positive momentum now and goodwill from the donors to get this right. And the fact that this is a discussion that's being had in a pretty deep technical way now across stakeholder groups, I think is a really good sign of the professionalization of these discussions in the sector. So setting clear terms on why, in what contexts and under what conditions this type of data can and should be collected and managed, and then communicating that clearly to everyone that your financing or policies affect is really the key role, I think, for donors. And then trying as much as possible, of course, keeping in mind different legal frameworks to which these different states are subject, to establish common positions on minimum standards, right? So what are the minimum commitments we want to make for the management of data in humanitarian context from a donor perspective? And what do we expect to see as a donor from our operational partners? I think that would be really helpful. And again, there's some really good work being done on that across the system. In terms of the more operational actors, and that includes the UN agencies that might double hat as donors or financiers of different work, I think in a similar vein to being clear and managing expectations, but also really creating space for deliberation and asking the right questions is maybe the most important thing. So the question with biometrics is not how do we use biometrics well? The question is, should we? And if so, how do we do that responsibly? And I think there's been a knee jerk in the sector, not just with biometrics, but with frankly all new technologies when they emerge in our work, to assume that their use is a fait accompli and that the decision is really how to do it and not whether. So create space in organizations to ask whether, and then dig into, if so, how to do that responsibly. This relates to the broader discussion around ethics in technology and data in the sector, and the fact that we do lack across the board, across stakeholder groups, the skills to deliberate effectively in a meaningful way on real ethical issues that arise with technology and data. So also investing in building that capacity is key. There is, I think, a red herring around the technical expertise that's required for doing this work well. Of course, that's required, but I would argue that humanitarian organizations have cut their teeth more effectively on that front than on the policy and ethics side of this issue. So investing more in really being able to do a risk assessment, deliberate ethical issues, and then put in place mitigation measures, technical, procedural, and policy, is something that really is a key responsibility of all operational actors. And those with the most resources and the deepest both bench and bandwidth to engage on these issues need to transfer or extend that support to other partners who may not have the same resourcing, but actually are on the front end of the risk. And I think that's the last point that I want to make on this, is that both for donors and for UN agencies and the INGOs that are really driving this work, there's been a tendency, and this has been discussed quite a lot in the context of the grand bargain, to transfer risk intentionally or unintentionally, but you rarely hear about benefits being transferred. And it sounds like a simplification, but actually, if we're recognizing that systematically risk is often transferred to those organizations and individuals on the front lines of delivering assistance, we need to be finding ways to make sure that we're transferring the benefits at least alongside the risks, if not instead of the risks, because often we, as larger entities with the resourcing that we have, are better able to sort of mitigate or at least absorb and absolve the risk than some of these more operational local actors. So transfer benefits alongside risks, if not fully instead of them, I think is a key thing to keep in mind And designing that from the beginning of an intervention before you've collected your first data point is essential.
Thanks, Stuart. I really appreciate the point that you're making about this, what we've seen, which is this real transfer of risk. Without the requisite support to come with that, we haven't seen donors really looking to look at who the risk has been placed on, and then ensure that those frontline organizations really have the capacity, the know-how, the technological setup to be doing safe data collection and safe data transfer. You asked a question in your comments that I think is really the question that comes to my mind when I listen to all three of you, which is, should the sector be gathering biometrics? I think based on the many points that you all have raised about the different dynamics at play, the different potential harms, the different risks, that is actually the question that we need to be asking. We're at a point where the sector now has been, to a certain extent, gathering biometrics. Certain organizations, other organizations have chosen not to, or not to until now. And so, I'd like to sort of turn and ask you, James and Elizabeth, to each answer that question. Do you think that the sector, or at least, parts of the sector, should or should not be gathering biometrics? It ties also into a comment that we've gotten, or a question from audience, which is this question of, does use of biometrics actually increase efficiency? Because all of the collection that we're talking about is premised on the idea that it does. And so I think it is a very important question to ask. I see it being something that many within the sector kind of assume is the case, but rarely critically examine. So I'll turn perhaps first to you, Elizabeth, and then to you, James, to answer that question.
Sure. So I think I guess the answer to the first question of should we is, initially I had written down in my notes, yes, but only if, and actually I think I would change it to no unless, just to say no unless all of these criteria are met. So unless there's a solid use case that benefits people that we're working with, unless we know what and we're confident about the data flow, we can map it, we have a clear plan for the data, unless we've done the engagement, the trust building, the informed consent, we understand the context, we've done all of the sort of the data protection and security requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So unless we can do all of that, no. We initially, Oxfam had a moratorium before this policy came out, because we didn't see, first have capacity to handle this kind of sensitive data. And then as we were building it, researched into the issue and still came to the conclusion that no, we were not able to process this kind of a data. And up until now, where we have the policy. And so it's still a very conservative approach, but recognizing that, number one, we want to be in the conversation, and that this is a reality that we're seeing. It's better to at least engage and try to put forward good data practice. The second question was on efficiency. So I think it's a really good point. I think the two main arguments that I see are that it reduces fraud and increases efficiency. I don't think that the research really shows that is a certainty. Actually, our own research anyway, that came out a couple of years ago, has shown that that's not well evidenced. So I think that given that we've already talked a bit about how context dependent this kind of data processing is, I would be happy to see more, positive use cases where, in fact, there was increased efficiency also for the beneficiary, not just for the organization, because frankly, I don't think that's good enough. It needs to also benefit the people that we're working with. Yeah, and I'll just stop there.
Thanks so much. I really like your formulation of no unless, and I think like that checklist that you gave is really important. And I hope that for listeners to this who are grappling with these questions and working in organizations that are grappling with these questions, that they really draw on your thinking on how you lay that out. James, I'd like to turn to you with the same question.
Thanks. It's a great question, and look, I'd agree with a lot of those reflections. I think part of the problem here is that we often look for a system-wide answer to questions like this that are actually quite contextual, and it's it would be analogous to looking for an answer to the question, should we use cars or should we use computers, or well, it depends on the context. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Starting from a standpoint of of caution is is not a bad place to start. But I like Stuart's framing here that your job with any technology innovation is to create space to ask those two critical questions: if and how. In the case of biometric technology, the if is contextual. Do you have a theory of change for your intervention that is linked to biometrics and makes it a good fit? If you don't, no, you shouldn't be using any technology if you can't articulate that, but particularly one that comes with heightened risks. And we touched earlier on some of the instances where biometrics are a good fit. There are some contexts where there is some quite good evidence for them being effective. We've done some work on HIV care and follow-up that use kind of pseudonymized biometrics, but is there a universal answer to this? No, absolutely not. It needs to be contextual and specific to your program. If you're considering them, you need to be evaluating if it's a good fit, and then beyond that, you need to be asking the how question. Do we have the capacity to do this? Do our partners, based on the context, both the program but also the people, what else do we need to do? Can we meaningfully not only step through some kind of informed consent process, but is there a meaningfully broad social contract we can conclude with these people, however we do it, through sensitization, consultation, involvement, inclusive design, that means we have a social settlement at the end of this process where people have actually bought in. And if you can't do that, you also probably shouldn't be using whatever the technology is that you're considering. And a lot of that comes down to a lot of these sorts of capacity issues and capability issues that we've been discussing. And again, I think it's admirable. One of Elizabeth's answers to one of your questions was about time frame. Does the scope of this particular piece of work allow us to do the how well? If it doesn't, then no. There are I think there are a range of bailout clauses you need in your approach to this and your decision-making process. And the answer isn't it depends, but no and less is a nice framing for it.
Thanks. We only have 3 minutes left. I'd like to give each of you a last minute to kind of either pull together your thoughts, pick up on any threads you've seen in the comments, or very specifically, if you wanted to give one message to the donors. The donors, I think, as all of you have brought out very clearly, are one of the main drivers of this push to collect biometrics, to assume that they should be integrated into programming without asking all of the questions that the three of you have raised, and really creating the assumption that data is essential to implementing programs. And so if you have a specific plea to the donors, please feel free to make it at this point. James, since you're unmuted, why don't I turn to you, and then Elizabeth, and then Stuart?
Yeah, happily. It's a good question. I think it's two things. I think it's funding and incentive alignment. A lot of the time, the solutions to these problems are very compliance-driven solutions. Somebody made the comment about shifting risk and a very legally kind of liability-heavy model of distributing funding and carrying out work very much leads to a lack of capacity and a kind of dispersal of the risk out into this nebulous, disempowered network of organizations with no capacity. So you need not to be doing that. You need to be thinking about how you meaningfully fund the outcomes that you want to see. Security and privacy, responsible data ethics, they're not free, they're complex. You need to be paying for it and you need to be incentivizing it. And there are many donors who are doing both of these things already. It needs to be there in grants, you need to be asking questions about it, you need to be selecting partners for it, you need to be writing it into funding that you issue. And thinking about it in a systemic way across the funding that you provide. And I think if you do that, the change will happen.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
So I will just end with the message that I give everyone I talk to within Oxfam, which is that having good data protection is good project planning. If you have a solid plan for what you're going to do with the data, you will also have a good project plan. So this isn't, an extra tick box to do on the side. It is more work than not doing it. But if you understand what's happening with the data and you're able to mitigate risks, you're also considering the person at the end of the line and what that personal data actually represents, which is someone and their livelihood and their family. And also on that last note, if I could just add an extra one, which is that, we talked a lot about sensitive data, biometric data today, but I would maybe just emphasize that on the note of personal data, it can be sensitive depending on the context. So a list of names can be damning in the wrong hands, whereas protected biometrics might actually be very safe. So it's really about understanding, again, thinking about the risk to an individual person or their community, depending on the context that they're in.
Thanks so much, Stuart.
Thanks, Bilkis. People who've heard me talk about this before will know that there's a quote that comes to mind for me when I think about humanitarian tech from Tom Stoppard, which is kind of the message I want to leave on, but also spin in a positive way. So Stoppard wrote that we cross our bridges when we come to them and burn them behind us with nothing to show for our memory except the smell of smoke and a presumption that once our eyes watered. And I think we do this with humanitarian technology because we are always running forward. We're running to the next technology. We have these debates, we deliberate, and then we forget the risks that we've identified or the benefits that we hoped to achieve. And then we never really look back to see whether the risks were realized or mitigated or whether the benefits actually bore fruit. So we need to do better. We need to actually document these processes. We need to research the effectiveness of what we expect to achieve from these different technologies and data science methods. And then we need to communicate that effectively. So ask the right questions, document the answers, and then, as the opening panel framed it, make sure that you're making time to pause, reflect, and then envision. I think that's really critical here as we are all fatigued with Zoom, as we are all overwhelmed with the amount of work we're trying to achieve together. We need to take that time to pause and look at these issues, document what we think we're learning, interrogate that later, and then constantly do better. That's really the goal here. And that's, I think, an important thing to remember, that talking about ethics is not about preventing bad things from happening alone. It's really about doing better work. And that is the spirit of humanitarian ethics. So let's keep that as a kind of lone star, that we need to be doing better, delivering better assistance to people affected by crisis. And this is the way to do it.
Thanks so much, Stuart. I love ending on that positive note. As viewers will have seen, we have amongst us in this sector, with these three panelists and many others, people who really want to do better and are trying to do better and push the system to do better. And I think it's really, as you said, that's the job ahead of us. It is possible, and it just requires taking the time and energy and attention to do that. So I want to thank you all for being with me today and answering my questions and the questions from the audience. I want to thank the audience so much for listening to this. I think it's a really important topic. I could have listened to you all for many hours and continued to discuss, but we'll close here. So thank you, all three.